For sure.
With us here tonight, criminal defense attorney and former Manhattan prosecutor Jeremy Saland, former federal prosecutor Jessica Roth. She's currently on the faculty at New York's Cardozo School of Law. Also CNN chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst John Miller. And John, let me just start with you. What do you think was behind the DA's decision to charge the case in this way?
I think the facts of the case. It's a unique case in that, we have seen mob hits on the street, but, I can't remember another case where we saw a lone gunman allegedly involved in extensive planning walk up behind somebody, the father of two, for the specific purpose of executing him because of his position as the head of the largest healthcare insurer in the United States. And that, according to the district attorney, is an attempt to coerce or influence the public or citizenry or an industry towards change, which is included in the terrorism charge.
Jeremy, inside the courtroom, what will prosecutors, what will the DA's office have to prove to make this stick?
As John just said, there's that necessary element. It's not just the intent to kill. It's not just the pre-planning to kill, but that objective and goal. In the penal law, 490 of the penal law, subsection 05, defines sort of three categories related to terrorism. I maybe objectively or subjectively believe this is a bit of a stretch. If I'm somebody, you kill a police officer, that's one thing. If you kill a witness to a crime, that's something else too that would rise to this first degree homicide or murder. But this is, I think, if I'm someone whose brother or sister or sibling was murdered on the street, why should a CEO's murder be treated differently than my loved one? I think it's trying to send a message, but I think it's going to also potentially cause them problems, and that's why they kept also that regular, if you will, murder too.
But even with the motivation, the idea of a political motivation in the writing, Jeremy?
That may be true, but the argument on the flip of that is whether it rises to the level of insanity and that mental defect. That is something you're going to argue, but is this something that Luigi had been planning and had railed against for years or decades, or is it something that recently in his mind, and he has a mental health issue, came to this place? That's the difference between really terrorism. When I think of terrorism, someone overseas or even a lone actor, and this particular case.
We'll circle back to insanity in just a moment, but I do think also the nature of these charges deals with the idea of possible nullification of a jury that might be influenced by politics, Jessica. And before Karen Freeman-Gnifilo was hired as the attorney, she was on AC 360, and she said she'd be worried about jury nullification were she prosecuting the case, noting the, quote, outpouring of support and sympathy for Mr. Mangione. So talk to me about how, if you would be concerned about that, and how these charges maybe play there.
Well, I think one reason why this charge was brought is because it does sort of up the stakes in terms of the penalty that he's facing. He'd be facing mandatory life imprisonment on this terrorism first-degree murder charge or second-degree murder charge with the terrorism enhancement. And so by including that, the district attorney is setting up the conditions for a plea to a lesser charge where he actually has the possibility of at some point getting out of prison. And so it could be a plea to that sort of regular second-degree murder charge that doesn't have the terrorism enhancement. If there isn't a plea, it's also setting up the conditions for a jury compromise on that lesser charge. And so if there are people in the jury room who either are not satisfied that the standard for terrorism is actually satisfied or in some way are sympathetic to the defendant, they might be willing to convict him on a lesser charge.
Yeah, they're going to hear a lot in that courtroom about terror. Now, since you both were speaking about the insanity thing, let me play a little bit more about what Gnifilo, again, said here on AC 360 about that possible defense. This was before she was on board with the defendant. Listen.
There might be a not guilty by reason of insanity defense that they're going to be thinking about because the evidence is going to be so overwhelming that he did what he did. And I hear what you're saying about being radicalized. I hear what you guys are saying. But as a former prosecutor in that office, I would be concerned that you have someone who is a valedictorian of his class. He was brilliant his whole life. He comes from this great family. I mean, something changed, right? Significantly, something changed. And they're going to, I think, potentially have a not guilty by reason of insanity potential defense.
All right. So how compelling is that defense? And again, where do the charges that we learned today play into that?
Well, so I think, again, this goes to Jeremy's point about the level of planning and detail. It's hard to sort of reconcile both an insanity defense, which is a really high standard under New York law, requires essentially showing the person didn't know the nature and quality of their actions or whether they knew what they were doing was wrong, and somebody who engages in this kind of very careful planning and execution, literally, of that kind of plan. And so I think that legally speaking, he's facing an uphill battle in making out an insanity defense. On the other hand, it may be that the defense strategy is just to get it to to the jury for consideration in the hopes that it'll essentially find some basis for the jury to acquit him.
I generally agree with that. I think one of the angles that Karen very well may take is that you can still plan. You can still not be fully aware. The law doesn't require that you are completely aware of the consequences and what you were doing, but that even with that planning, he was still ill. And I would add also that there may be the approaches that even if it doesn't reach that legal bar, it will be used to mitigate the conduct to say, hey, let's pull it back down, even if it doesn't find its way into a courtroom.
I always get nervous when John Miller's checking his devices because it means there's some new information coming in. You are getting some new information about what's going on inside prison with Mangione.
So our own Danny Freeman, who's covering Philadelphia and this case, said, you know, since he's been there, he's gotten 33 pieces of mail, 6 messages. Let me just make sure I didn't get that wrong, but 33 emails, 8 pieces of mail. So it's part of the sign that you have both shown cognizance of that there is developing more than the profile of a suspect. There's developing the cult of personality, where before he's even really been arraigned on a murder charge, he's already getting what I'm going to suggest is likely fan mail as a bounce from what we're seeing on the internet.
What does that mean for both the prosecution and defense here? Because this is a reality. I mean, look, we hear from the law enforcement how upset they are that this guy's being lionized here, but it's happening. So what does that mean for the prosecution?
And I want to circle back to the earlier point, which is he walked up behind a man who, whatever business he's in and however reviled that business may be, he shot in the back, who was the father of 2, who was a human being, and that seems to be skipped over in the lionizing of him, to use the police commissioner's word.
So the lionizing of him is incredibly disturbing, and I think it goes back to why the district attorney, and he said in the press conference that was part of why they were bringing such serious charges to us, to express their incredible the seriousness of this case. But going back to the problem that the lionizing poses, I think the jury selection process is going to be really challenging. And there may be people there who actually are trying to get onto the jury because they are sympathetic to him. And so I think that process of voir dire is going to be even more important than it is in a different kind of case.
And I also think we'll be watching every step of the way. Every time he walks into public, what will he say? Will he choose to speak out or act out and continue to play to the crowd here?
And in addition, 157 deposits into his prison account from outside people.
All right, friends, thank you very much. John, do not go far.